What happens when the person everyone underestimates turns out to be the one holding the truth that no amount of money can bury? Picture this: a packed courtroom in New York City, the air thick with tension. The polished wood benches creak under the weight of people leaning forward, desperate to catch every word. At the front, under the cold glow of fluorescent lights, sits Richard, a man who believes his wealth makes him untouchable. His tailored suit shines under the cameras. His lawyer whispers strategies, and the smirk on his face is the kind only a man drunk on power could wear. But then across the room, a woman walks in. A woman who doesn't wear designer clothes, who doesn't have a title to her name. She's not an executive, not a lawyer, not someone the world would label as important. She's a cleaner. And Richard laughs under his breath, leans toward his attorney, and mutters, "She's just a cleaner. No one will believe her." Have you ever been dismissed like that? Judged, not by your worth, but by your title? Have you ever felt invisible in a room full of people who believed they mattered more than you? If you have, stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. This isn't just another court case. This is a story about arrogance, about how the rich and powerful often mistake silence for weakness. Richard believes he can bend the system, buy loyalty, and laugh off accusations. For him, the courtroom is a stage, and he's convinced he's still the star. But here's where things begin to shift, because sometimes the truth doesn't come from the men in suits or the polished testimonies. Sometimes it comes from the hands that scrub the floors after the lawyers have gone home. Sometimes the strongest voice is the one nobody bothered to hear. Sarah, the cleaner, never asked to be here. She never dreamed of standing in front of a judge, with an entire city watching. Her life is far from glamorous. She works late nights, raises her son alone, and carries herself with a quiet dignity. And yet here she is, about to speak words that could change everything. Richard doesn't see it. He doesn't see her. He thinks this is just another moment where his money will carry him through. But look closer at Sarah. Notice the calm way she carries herself, the way her eyes don't flinch even as Richard mocks her presence. There's something she knows, something he doesn't expect, and it has the power to turn this courtroom upside down. Stories like this remind us of the fragile balance between wealth and truth, between arrogance and humility. And maybe you've been there too, overlooked, underestimated, brushed aside because someone thought your job, your background, or your silence meant you had no voice. But what if that silence was holding the very evidence no one else could see? What if the one the world calls insignificant is the one holding the key to justice? As Sarah takes her seat, the courtroom shifts. The judge leans forward, curious. The jury exchanges glances. Even the audience grows restless. Something about her presence whispers that this won't be as simple as Richard thinks. He still smirks, still rolls his eyes, convinced this is beneath him. But what you're about to witness is how quickly arrogance crumbles when truth stands tall. And so, with all eyes locked on her, Sarah prepares to speak, not with anger, not with drama, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. What she's about to reveal will not only shock Richard, but shake the very foundation of the courtroom itself. And maybe that's why this moment feels so powerful, not just because of what Sarah is about to reveal, but because of what it represents. It's not only her story, in some way it's ours too. How many times have you been overlooked, underestimated, or made to feel small? How many times has someone dismissed you simply because of where you came from or what you do for a living? If that feeling stirs something inside you right now, I'd love for you to share it in the comments. Tell me if you've ever been in Sarah's shoes, or if you've ever watched someone else rise above the labels that society tried to stick on them. Your story might be exactly what another person scrolling through needs to read today. And while you're here, if this kind of story speaks to you, take a second to like this video. It may seem like a small gesture, but it's how these stories get lifted higher, how they reach more people who need to be reminded that truth and dignity still matter. Every single like tells me that you value this space where we can uncover these lessons together. If you want to keep walking this path with me, exploring more stories that challenge arrogance, reveal hidden strength, and remind us of the humanity we all share, then make sure you subscribe. That way, you won't miss the next chapter, and you'll be part of this growing community of people who believe that even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. Because in the end, this isn't just my channel, it's a conversation we build together, and your participation, whether it's a comment, a like, or that simple click to subscribe, is what makes it possible for these messages to keep traveling, to keep reaching new hearts. Now, as the courtroom holds its breath and Sarah prepares to open her mouth, let's step closer to the moment that will silence Richard's arrogance once and for all. While Richard's world glittered with lights and excess, Sarah's unfolded in the quiet corners most people never notice. She lived on the edge of Brooklyn, in a modest apartment where the walls carried the laughter of her young son, Ethan, and the echoes of a life built on resilience. The building wasn't glamorous, peeling paint on the stairwell, neighbors whose struggles mirrored her own, but it was home. Every morning, Sarah rose before the sun, tying her hair back in a neat bun, not because she cared about appearances, but because discipline was survival. Her mornings began with Ethan's sleepy smile, a bowl of cereal, and a whispered reminder, "Mom, you're my hero." Those words fueled her more than any paycheck ever could. Her days were long, split between cleaning offices uptown and late shifts in the courthouse downtown. The world passed her by in suits and polished shoes, barely sparing her a glance as she emptied bins, wiped tables, or scrubbed floors. To them, she was background, part of the invisible machinery that kept their lives running smoothly. But Sarah didn't see herself that way. She saw dignity in work, in the small victories that came from knowing she was building a future for Ethan. Each dollar saved was a promise that one day he would have opportunities she had been denied. There was a hidden strength in her silence. While Richard filled rooms with arrogance, Sarah filled her life with quiet determination. She didn't have the luxury of shortcuts or the illusion of being untouchable. Every decision mattered, every mistake carried consequences. She lived with the constant pressure of bills, the uncertainty of rising rent, and the heavy responsibility of being both mother and provider. And yet, when she looked at Ethan's wide eyes, she found the courage to keep moving forward. At night, when the courthouse emptied and silence replaced the chaos of the day, Sarah slipped in through side doors with her cart of supplies. The grand halls that intimidated others became her workplace. She moved past the tall wooden doors of courtrooms, past rows of empty benches, past portraits of stern-faced judges. She noticed details others ignored, the echoes of footsteps, the faint smell of old books, the papers left scattered on desks. She wasn't searching for anything, but life has a way of placing us where we're meant to be. More than once, she overheard conversations she was never supposed to hear. Lawyers arguing about evidence, secretaries whispering about deals, Richard himself boasting about how no one could touch him. He never noticed her, never paused his conversations because of her presence. In his mind, she wasn't even there. That invisibility became her cloak. She collected fragments, not because she wanted revenge, but because she understood the weight of truth. Sarah's humility didn't mean weakness. It meant she carried herself with a quiet kind of power, one that didn't demand recognition, but left an impact on those who took the time to see her. Neighbors often turned to her for advice, not because she had wealth, but because she had perspective. "You always know the right thing to say," an elderly tenant once told her after she helped resolve a dispute. Sarah only smiled. "Sometimes listening is more important than speaking," she replied. That mindset, forged in struggle, made her stronger than she realized. The journey that led her to this courtroom wasn't one she chose, but one that seemed written behind the scenes. of her life. Each late-night shift, each careless word Richard threw into the air, each document tossed into the trash became part of a larger picture. Transformation doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. It often begins quietly, in the spaces no one watches. For Sarah, the transformation wasn't just about exposing Richard. It was about stepping into a truth that gave her voice meaning. When she thought about standing before the judge, her stomach tightened with nerves. She wasn't used to being the center of attention. She wasn't trained in legal jargon or public speaking. She was a cleaner, a mother, a woman who knew the weight of sacrifice. But that was exactly why her presence carried such gravity. She represented every unseen hand that keeps the world turning, every quiet soul dismissed by those in power. There were nights when exhaustion nearly broke her, nights when she returned home so tired she could barely stand, yet still sat at the edge of Ethan's bed to kiss his forehead and whisper, "One day things will be better." Those words weren't just for him, they were for herself. They were promises spoken in the dark, promises that kept her going when hope felt like a distant light. She never sought recognition, but destiny has a way of turning the overlooked into the unforgettable. In a city obsessed with wealth and status, Sarah embodied a truth too many forget. That value isn't measured in bank accounts or business titles, but in integrity, resilience, and courage. And though Richard believed his money could shield him forever, Sarah's presence was proof that no fortress of arrogance is strong enough to withstand the weight of truth. So when she stepped into the courtroom, her simple shoes tapping against the polished floor, it wasn't just another shift. It was the moment when invisibility turned into undeniable presence. She didn't walk with the swagger of wealth or the entitlement of power. She walked with the quiet strength of someone who had carried burdens heavier than any judgment that room could hand down. Her very presence was a revelation, a reminder that sometimes the voices we dismiss are the ones carrying the deepest impact. And as Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking, whispering again to his lawyer, he still didn't understand. He thought this was just another day, another obstacle his money would clear away. What he couldn't see was that the very person he had overlooked was about to become the key to his undoing, the witness whose testimony would carry more weight than all his wealth combined. The air in the courtroom shifted when Sarah looked up, her eyes steady, her hands folded calmly in her lap. For the first time, the invisible was visible. For the first time, the background stepped into the center, and as the room held its breath, waiting for her voice, the stage was set for a revelation that would change everything. The courtroom was packed that morning, a place that usually carried the quiet weight of justice, but now buzzed like a stage before the curtain rose. Journalists filled the benches, their pens ready, their cameras pointed at the man who once seemed untouchable. Richard walked in as though he owned the very building, his polished shoes clicking against the floor in sharp rhythm. He wore his confidence like armor, nodding faintly at the people he recognized, other businessmen, lawyers, acquaintances who whispered his name as if it were still synonymous with power. For him, this wasn't a trial, it was a performance. When the charges of fraud and corruption were read aloud, Richard smirked as if the words belonged to someone else. Fraud was a label for the desperate, corruption for the weak. In his mind, he was neither. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered, "They'll spin their wheels, and we'll walk out of here by lunch." His lawyer nodded, more cautiously than Richard noticed, but Richard didn't register hesitation. He saw only his own reflection in the polished table, a man who believed victory was inevitable. And then Sarah entered. Her steps were quiet, almost hesitant, but her presence was undeniable. The entire courtroom shifted as she approached the witness stand, though not because she commanded authority in the traditional sense. It was because she didn't belong in Richard's carefully constructed world, and that contrast made everyone sit up straighter. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, the kind chosen more for practicality than presentation. Her hair was pulled back, her hands clasped together, as though steadying herself against the enormity of the moment. Richard caught sight of her and laughed. The sound was low at first, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. He leaned toward his attorney again, shaking his head in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered, his voice dripping with scorn. "She empties my trash. What could she possibly know?" The words carried, bouncing off the walls of the courtroom, filling the air, with a sharp injustice that made a few jurors glance at one another. The arrogance of it, the dismissal, was so blatant that even the judge paused, his brow furrowing slightly. But Richard didn't care. He leaned back in his chair, still smirking, convinced the entire scene was a waste of time. Sarah didn't respond with anger. She didn't need to. She took her seat, placed her hands carefully on the wooden stand before her, and looked straight ahead. Her silence carried more dignity than Richard's. Wealth ever could. The contrast between them was undeniable, the millionaire cloaked in ego and the cleaner cloaked in quiet strength. The prosecution cleared their throat and began. They asked Sarah to state her name, her occupation. Her voice was soft but steady. "My name is Sarah Miller. I work as a cleaner. I've been cleaning offices and courtrooms for almost 10 years. She didn't exaggerate, didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth. Richard chuckled again, unable to contain himself. 10 years of mopping floors, he said under his breath, but loud enough to be heard. Some expert witness. His lawyer shifted uncomfortably, wishing Richard would stay quiet, but Richard had never learned the art of silence. For him, power was proven in volume, in the dismissal of others. The jury's eyes flicked between the two of them. On one side, the millionaire who mocked with every breath. On the other, the maid who sat with her shoulders straight, unshaken by his contempt. The room could feel the contrast. Wealth versus humility, arrogance versus dignity, noise versus truth. The judge adjusted his glasses and spoke firmly. "Mr. Anderson, this court will not tolerate further interruptions. If you cannot contain yourself, I will." His voice carried authority, but Richard only shrugged, still wearing the smirk of a man who thought even the law bent in his direction. For Sarah, the moment was more than testimony. It was transformation. All her life she had worked in the shadows, invisible to men like Richard, and yet here she was, her voice echoing in a room that had always belonged to the powerful. She wasn't there to trade insults or prove her worth in Richard's eyes. She was there because she carried the hidden truth, the kind of truth that had the power to shift decisions, break illusions, and bring down walls built on lies. The prosecutor leaned closer, asking her to explain why she had been called. The courtroom waited, restless, curious, and in that silence, in that suspension of expectation, Sarah drew in a breath and prepared to speak. Richard rolled his eyes, whispering one last jab to his attorney. "This is pathetic. Watch her crumble." But what he didn't understand, what he could never understand, was that the woman he mocked wasn't about to crumble. She was about to reveal something that would impact the entire room, something that would rewrite the balance of power he thought was permanent. As the first words left her lips, calm and unwavering, the energy in the courtroom shifted again. What began as Richard's performance was slowly turning into Sarah's stage, and every person watching felt the weight of that transformation. What Richard dismissed as nothing more than background noise was beginning to rise into a revelation he couldn't control. And in that fragile moment, balanced between arrogance and truth, the entire room leaned forward, waiting for the next sentence. A breath moved through the room like a single ripple across still water, and then the murmur started. Short, shocked exhalations, a hush that wasn't really silence, but a collection of people holding judgment in their lungs. The jurors exchanged glances, as if trying to confirm they'd heard him right. Reporters tilted their heads and scribbled with renewed hunger. Even the court officers looked up from habit to attention. Richard's arrogance had already been obvious, but to say it out loud, to brand her usefulness by what fit in a broom closet, made the air feel charged, unstable. It wasn't just rude, it was a declaration of hierarchy. In his world, worth came with a title, a driver, a corner office. The courtroom felt that wound in real time. Sarah didn't flinch. Her shoulders stayed level, chin straight, hands folded with the care of someone who understood that composure is not a gift, but a decision. She had learned long ago that anger burns energy she needed for the journey, so she let it drift past her. Inside, her pulse raced, but it kept a steady rhythm, like the sound of her own footsteps down quiet hallways at midnight. She didn't look at Richard. She didn't need to. The mindset that had guided her through years of unseen work guided her again now. Focus, breathe, speak only what's true. Judge Thompson leaned forward with the patience of a man who had seen both theatre and truth in these walls. He removed his glasses, polished them with the hem of his robe, then returned them to his face, as if what came next needed a sharper lens. "Let's hear what she has to say," he said, so measured and calm that it felt like a gavel without sound. The room settled. Pens hovered. Phones paused mid-swipe. Curiosity, once scattered, gathered in a single point. The woman who, a minute ago, was dismissed as furniture. The prosecutor stepped a fraction closer, careful not to break the fragile balance. His tone softened, not out of pity, but out of respect for the gravity in her stillness. He started with simple questions, the kind that build a foundation before any revelation can stand. Name, occupation, years in service. Sarah answered plainly. "My name is Sarah Miller. I clean offices and courtrooms. Almost 10 years. No drama, no embroidery. Truth doesn't need accessories." A faint scrape of leather against wood sounded as Richard crossed his legs and looked toward the jury with a tight smile, like a performer waiting for the punchline to land. He was still confident that the whole thing would collapse under the weight of its own absurdity. But the jury wasn't smiling back. There was something about the way Sarah occupied the space, quietly and fully, that made people re-examine their first impressions. Maybe it was the way she didn't try to impress them. Maybe it was the way her presence, so grounded, made arrogance look like a costume. "Ms. Miller," the prosecutor said gently, "can you describe your typical duties after hours?" She took a breath, and the cadence of her answer carried the invisible schedule of a city that never sleeps. "I arrive after everyone leaves," she said. "I empty the bins, wipe the desks, reset chairs, sometimes gather papers that are left behind if they've fallen or if they're in danger of being damaged. Usually, I just put them neatly in a stack." Her voice didn't ask for credit. It asked to be accurate. Richard shifted, impatience flickering across his face. He shot a glance at his lawyer that said, "Let's end this." His attorney whispered back, "Not yet." But the whisper couldn't erase the earlier mockery that had already entered the room and taken a seat among the facts, visible to everyone. The prosecutor continued, bridging the ordinary to the extraordinary with careful steps. He moved through her routine like a map maker, each detail a road that might lead somewhere unexpected. She described the late nights, the echo of her cartwheels, the way the courthouse felt different when empty, bigger somehow, as if its purpose expanded without the crowds. She explained how certain offices required special clearance, how names on plaques became part of her mental geography, how she learned to listen for alarms, for the hum of copy machines left on, for the sound of someone forgetting to lock a door. It was the behind-the-scenes rhythm of a building most people only knew at full roar. The judge watched her closely, not with suspicion, but with curiosity sharpened by decades. He recognized the weight of small details and how they sometimes turned into hinges for larger doors. He glanced briefly at the jury, noting heads tilt, eyes narrow, pens stop. This wasn't about drama, it was about decisions, the kind that build case law and reroute lives. Sarah's calm held. She kept her gaze forward, not hiding, not performing. When the prosecutor asked if she ever worked in Richard's offices, she answered, "Yes." The word didn't ring with victory. It sat there like a key placed on a table. "How often?" he asked. 2 to 3 nights a week, she said. Sometimes more when there were meetings late. A murmur rolled through the gallery, light but noticeable. That small fact had an immediate impact. It was one thing for her to be a cleaner in the abstract. It was entirely different for her to be a recurring witness to the aftermath of Richard's power, his meetings, his papers, his carelessness. The defense attorney rose, objected on grounds of relevance, but the judge lifted a hand, and the objection fell away. The path forward was narrow but clear. Let her define the canvas before anyone tries to paint over it. Describe the office, the prosecutor said. What do you recall about its layout? Sarah closed her eyes for a second, not to dramatize, but to be precise. Conference table near the window, she said. Laptop dock, 2 monitors left side, bar cart in the corner, a shredder that jammed often, wastebasket to the right of his chair under the armrest. She opened her eyes. He liked the room cold. Objection, the defense said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Judge Thompson nodded slowly. Overruled. The witness may continue. There was a subtle shift in the jury's posture. The human mind knows the difference between someone guessing and someone remembering. The exactness of Sarah's details didn't shout. It resonated. You could feel the transformation in the room, a recalibration of status. People who had walked in expecting spectacle were being asked to respect accuracy instead, and the change was quietly magnetic. The prosecutor paced the length of the counsel table, not for show, but to control the tempo. Ms. Miller, he said, on the nights you cleaned Mr. Anderson's office, did anything stand out to you as unusual? The question landed in the center of the room and waited. A soft click from a camera sounded like a metronome. Richard's jaw tensed. He looked toward his wife sitting 2 rows back, perfectly styled, perfectly still, and for the first time that morning, a sliver of uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Sarah didn't rush. Sometimes there were shredded strips left outside the bin, she said. I'd sweep them up. Sometimes tabs on folders would be on the floor. Once there was an envelope pushed behind the chair. I put it on the desk. The prosecutor asked, Did you open anything? No, she replied. That's not my decision to make. The choice of words lingered. Decision. Not impulse, not accident. Decision. Her ethics were not performative. They were practiced. The defense rose again, objecting preemptively to any suggestion that her proximity equaled knowledge. Judge Thompson cut him off this time with a brief shake of the head. Counsel, you'll have your cross. For now, the witness is describing her observations. It was subtle, but the judge's tone contained a protective logic. Truth builds on what people see and remember before it blooms into what they understand. In the gallery, a woman in a grey blazer leaned toward her colleague and whispered, What does she know? The question wasn't cynical. It was genuinely curious. That curiosity spread, filling every corner like a slow, rising tide. The narrative had shifted from whether Sarah belonged here to what Sarah could reveal, from ranking people by status to measuring them by substance. Suspense doesn't always come from surprise. Sometimes it comes from the steady approach of a hidden truth. Richard leaned forward and finally spoke again, louder than before, trying to reassert the script. This is absurd, he said, his voice edged with impatience. She's guessing. She doesn't understand what she's talking about. The judge's eyes cooled. Mr. Anderson, he said, this is your last warning. Richard exhaled sharply through his nose and sat back, a man accustomed to having the final word and struggling to accept that he didn't own the next sentence. The prosecutor shifted to context, dates, nights of late meetings, unusual traffic in and out of the office after hours. Sarah answered with the even cadence of someone who built memory out of routine. Which nights the recycling overflowed, which nights the conference table had water rings from too many glasses, which nights the hallway smelled faintly of cologne and cigars. Each small note formed a pattern, and the pattern suggested continuity rather than coincidence. Did you ever hear conversations while working? The prosecutor asked. A new stillness found the room. It was the kind of question that weighed responsibility against necessity. Sarah nodded once. Sometimes, she said. I try not to. But sometimes people don't notice I'm there. No bitterness colored the words. They were a simple acknowledgement of how invisibility works when people choose not to see. "What did you hear?" the prosecutor asked, careful with the shape of the question. "Not yet!" the defense snapped, but it was too late to seal the curiosity that had already broken open. Judge Thompson raised a palm toward the prosecutor as a reminder to proceed properly, then looked at Sarah with a steadiness that said, "Choose carefully, but do not be afraid." The judge had the gravity of someone who knew that revelations, once spoken, cannot be returned to silence. Sarah drew a breath and glanced down at her hands, the same hands that had pushed a cart through hushed corridors and reset rooms so others could claim they were always pristine. "I heard names," she said quietly. "I heard numbers. I heard people talk like consequences were for other people." She didn't look at Richard when she said it, but the words found him anyway. He stared at her with the incredulity of a man who has spent his life believing that rooms belong only to those who pay for them. The prosecutor asked her to describe how she keeps track of time during shifts. "By tasks," she said, "by flaws, sometimes by the music in my earbuds when I'm alone. I remember sequences more than clocks." It was an answer that made sense to anyone who'd ever worked a job measured in tasks rather than titles. It also implied that her memory wasn't weak. It was structured by routine, strengthened by repetition. The tension thickened, not chaotic, but coiled. It wasn't the kind of suspense that screams. It was the kind that waits, knowing the next revelation will change the angle of the light for everyone in the room. In that waiting, you could feel two mindsets in collision, one built on spectacle and control, the other on patience and quiet observation. Richard's strategies relied on speed and pressure. Sarah's presence relied on stillness. The judge inclined his head, inviting the prosecutor to proceed with more precision. "Ms. Miller," the prosecutor said, voice low, "without sharing conclusions, can you tell the court whether anything you saw or heard led you to believe there were materials that should not have been discarded?" The question hovered like a bridge suspended over fog. Richard's elbow hit the table by accident, just a small thud, but it sounded loud in the expectant. "Hush." "Yes," Sarah said. The word wasn't triumphant, it was careful. More than once. A beat passed. Another. The gallery inhaled, then forgot to exhale. Even the clock on the back wall seemed to soften its tick. Somewhere near the doors, a phone buzzed and went quiet again, embarrassed at intruding. The jury leaned in almost imperceptibly, as if proximity could make truth arrive faster. "What did you do?" the prosecutor asked, "when you found materials that seemed out of place?" Sarah met his gaze. "I made decisions," she said, "to protect what was not mine, to protect myself, to protect my son." The mention of Ethan didn't cheapen the moment, it grounded it. This wasn't a story about corporate maneuvers, it was about impact, how choices made behind polished doors ripple outward into the lives of people who never sat at those tables. Richard's lawyer stood again, objecting to the tenor of the question, objecting to the phrasing of the answer, objecting to the very idea that a cleaner could become the axis on which a case might turn. The judge listened, patient but unmoved, and overruled with a crisp nod. He looked at Sarah with quiet gravity, not encouraging, not discouraging, but creating a space where the path forward belonged to her words. What does she know? The question repeated itself in the silence, as if the building itself had started to ask. Not just what did she hear, but what did she understand? Not just what passed through her hands, but what remained with her. Because it mattered. The journey from invisibility to testimony is not a leap. It's a series of steps, each anchored by choices that define character long before they shape outcomes. Sarah steadied her breath, the way she had done countless times at the end of a long shift when a room needed to be reset perfectly, even though no one would ever thank her for it. Her voice, when it came, was calm, unhurried, and it carried a weight that felt older than this morning, older than this case, like the sound of a truth that had waited long enough and was done waiting. And as the courtroom leaned forward in one shared motion, a single thought threaded through the tension like a wire drawn tight. Behind-the-scenes details were about to become center stage, and the first of the revelations would land where no one expected them to, reshaping not only the case, but the way every person in that room understood who gets to hold the floor. The courtroom seemed to shrink around Sarah as the air thickened, the silence stretching until even the smallest movement sounded amplified. Every gaze was on her now, not because she had demanded attention, but because the weight of anticipation made it impossible to look anywhere else. She breathed once, then again, her voice steady as she spoke words that felt like stones placed carefully in the foundation of a larger truth. "I worked in Mr. Anderson's offices many nights," she began, her tone quiet yet deliberate, as if each syllable needed its own space. "And when you're invisible to people, they forget you're there. They don't lower their voices, they don't hide their papers, they assume you can't understand." She paused, not for drama, but for clarity. But I listened, and I understood more than they thought. A murmur rippled through the gallery, hushed yet undeniable. The jurors leaned in, pens momentarily still, eyes sharpened by the gravity of her statement. The judge adjusted his glasses, his posture more attentive, signaling the court that what followed mattered. Richard shifted uncomfortably, his smirk faltering for the first time since he had taken his seat. Sarah continued, her tone unwavering. "I overheard conversations about money being moved where it shouldn't be. I heard numbers that didn't match the reports I'd see scattered across his desk, and I saw documents, contracts, transfers, signed agreements, tossed into the trash as if they didn't mean anything, but they did mean something. They were proof." Richard slammed his palm against the table, unable to hold back. "This is outrageous. She's lying." His voice cut through the room like broken glass, but the judge was quicker, his gavel striking once with authority. "Mr. Anderson, enough. This is a court of law. You will sit down." Richard glared, but the command was iron, and he sank reluctantly into his chair, jaw tight, eyes flashing with anger he could no longer disguise. The prosecutor walked closer to the stand, careful not to press too hard, but guiding Sarah toward the revelation that would anchor the case. "Ms. Miller, what did you do when you found these documents?" Her fingers tightened around the wood of the witness stand, but her voice didn't waver. "At first, I put them back. I thought it wasn't my place, but then I realized if I didn't, no one else would, and if I stayed silent, people would get hurt, so I made a decision." She glanced briefly at Ethan, seated quietly with a neighbor in the gallery, his small face peeking over the edge of the bench. "I collected them, carefully, quietly. I kept them safe." The transformation in the room was almost physical. What began as doubt now shifted into awe. Sarah's humility, the same quality Richard had mocked, became her greatest strength. She had chosen truth over fear, integrity over silence. She hadn't sought power, yet here she was, holding more of it in her testimony than Richard's millions could buy. Richard's lawyer rose quickly, voice sharp. "Objection! She is not qualified to determine the meaning of these documents." But before the prosecutor could respond, Judge Thompson leaned forward, his tone calm yet firm. "She doesn't have to be. Her testimony speaks to what she observed and what she preserved. That is for the court to weigh." "Overruled." Richard's face reddened, his composure unraveling in small, visible cracks. He turned to his lawyer, whispering furiously, "Do something. Stop this." His lawyer avoided eye contact, scribbling notes as if ink could shield him from the collapse happening before their eyes. Sarah's voice carried on, unshaken. "I knew these papers weren't trash. I knew they weren't scraps to be thrown away. They told a story, a hidden story, about decisions made behind closed doors, about money moved in ways it shouldn't have been. I didn't understand every detail, but I understood enough to know they were wrong, and I couldn't ignore that." The jury hung on her every word. Each phrase landed like a revelation, peeling back the illusion Richard had built around himself. For years, he had operated with the mindset that arrogance was invincibility, that invisibility meant irrelevance. Yet now, the opposite was true. Sarah's quiet observation had become the spotlight, and Richard's empire was unraveling under it. The prosecutor asked, "Miss Miller, are these the documents you preserved?" An assistant wheeled forward a small box, sealed, labeled, chain of custody intact. Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, those are the ones." The prosecutor held one up, a contract with Richard's signature, its numbers glaringly inconsistent with the public filings. Gasps echoed through the gallery as the hidden truth took visible form. Richard half rose from his seat, face twisted with desperation. "You can't use that. She stole those. She had no right." But the judge's gavel fell again, harder this time. "Sit down, Mr. Anderson. This court will not tolerate further outbursts." Sarah's eyes flicked toward Richard, not in triumph, but in quiet defiance. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. "You threw them away. You thought no one cared. But I did." The words struck like a gavel of their own, echoing louder than the judge's. The gallery stirred, people exchanging glances, some nodding quietly as if justice was beginning to rise from the shadows. Even the jurors seemed moved, their pens scratching faster, their expressions no longer neutral but thoughtful, engaged. The impact of her courage wasn't just in the evidence she had gathered, it was in the contrast it painted. Richard's arrogance, loud and careless, had blinded him. Sarah's humility, patient and deliberate, had given her the clarity to see what others ignored. He thought silence was weakness. She proved it was strength. He believed wealth bought protection. She showed that integrity was untouchable. The judge leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if already weighing the revelation against the law. "Ms. Miller," he said, "do you understand the significance of what you've done?" Sarah swallowed, but nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I know it could change everything." And it would. The journey from invisibility to testimony was now complete, and the revelations Sarah carried were no longer hidden in shadows or buried in trash bins. They were out in the open, standing taller than Richard's fortune, heavier than his reputation. The courtroom felt it, the transformation of power, the shift in narrative, the sense that the tide had turned irrevocably. Richard sat stiffly, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape that no longer existed. For the first time, he looked smaller, not in stature but in presence. His empire of arrogance had no footing here. And while the prosecutor carefully organized the documents on the table, preparing to present each piece of evidence like a weapon forged from Richard's own carelessness, Sarah remained calm. Her journey had never been about revenge. It was about responsibility, about making decisions that mattered not just for herself, but for those who couldn't stand in that courtroom. Her courage was not loud, but it was absolute, and its impact reverberated in every corner of the room. The suspense tightened again, not because the revelation had ended, but because it had only just begun. The documents were there, the testimony was clear, but the question lingered in the air. Like a storm about to break, what would come next? When the weight of truth pressed fully against the walls of Richard's empire, Richard's mask cracked the moment the first page slid across the polished wood of the prosecution's table. His voice, usually smooth and calculated, broke into a harsh bark that startled even his own lawyer. "This is a joke!" he shouted, slamming his palm down hard enough to rattle the glasses of water lined neatly along the table. The force echoed, desperate rather, than commanding, like a man trying to shout down an avalanche already roaring toward him. Judge Thompson's gavel came down with a decisive crack, louder than Richard's outburst. The sound carried authority that didn't need to be explained. "Mr. Anderson," the judge said, his voice low but sharp as steel, "this is a courtroom, not your boardroom. You will remain silent unless addressed. One more interruption, and I will have you removed." The words weren't a warning, they were a sentence waiting to be carried out. Richard froze, the redness creeping up his neck betraying the storm inside him. He had spent a lifetime intimidating board members, silencing employees, and bending people to his will. Yet here, in a space he couldn't buy or control, his power shrank with every breath. He leaned toward his attorney, whispering furiously, "Fix this, do something." But his lawyer's silence said more than words could. There was nothing to fix. The documents spoke for themselves. The prosecutor picked one up, holding it where the jury could see. The black ink glared against the white page like scars, a contract bearing Richard's signature, numbers that twisted reality into lies, amounts hidden in layers of manipulation that even a layperson could spot as wrong. Sarah sat quietly, her presence steady, her dignity unshaken. She had already carried the hardest part, bringing truth into the open. Now the paper trail, undeniable and precise, carried the rest. "This document," the prosecutor said, voice clear and deliberate, "was found discarded in Mr. Anderson's office. It shows direct authorization for transfers to shell accounts overseas, transfers Mr. Anderson denied under oath." The courtroom stirred, a low hum of disbelief running through the benches. One juror covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide. Another scribbled notes with such intensity the pen nearly tore the paper. Richard's fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned pale. "They're twisting this," he hissed, half to his lawyer, half to himself. "It doesn't mean anything. Anyone could have forged." The judge's gavel struck again. "Enough." The word rang louder than Richard's protest, stripping his voice of its weight. The prosecutor lifted another document, this one showing correspondence, emails printed and discarded, where Richard had spoken casually about burying funds and manipulating audits. His words, once uttered with arrogance and secrecy, now filled the room with a kind of shame he couldn't escape. He shifted in his seat, each revelation pressing against him like a wall closing in. Sarah's eyes remained forward, her expression neither triumphant nor vengeful. Her courage didn't need theatrics. She had made a decision long before this day, that silence was no longer an option. And now, with the documents spread like cards on a table, her choice was reshaping the course of justice. The judge turned his gaze to Richard, his tone steady but piercing. "These are your signatures. Mr. Anderson, these are your words. You may try to dismiss the witness, but you cannot dismiss yourself." The authority in his voice left no room for interpretation. Richard's empire, built on deception and the illusion of control, began to crumble in front of everyone. For years, he had believed his mindset, calculated arrogance, ruthless ambition, made him invincible. But now, the very decisions he made in secret, the behind-the-scenes manipulations he thought invisible, had surfaced with a clarity that burned. The hidden truth had become the spotlight, and under its glare he looked small. His wife sat motionless in the gallery, her face pale, her carefully constructed life unraveling alongside his. Associates who once flocked to his side now leaned away, as if proximity alone might stain them. The air was thick with the revelation that power without integrity collapses when even a single voice dares to speak. Richard tried again, his voice shaking this time. The arrogance fractured. "You don't understand how business works. This is normal. Everyone does this." The words, meant to defend, only condemned him further. They exposed the depth of his corruption, the ease with which he justified betrayal. The judge's eyes narrowed, his voice cutting through the room. "No, Mr. Anderson, not everyone lies under oath. Not everyone defrauds the system. That is not business. That is crime." Each page that landed before the jury was another blow, another fracture in the foundation Richard had believed unshakable. His wealth, his influence, his carefully curated image, none of it mattered against the ink of his own hand. Every attempt to laugh it off, to dismiss Sarah, to twist the narrative fell flat against the undeniable evidence. And through it all, Sarah remained calm. She hadn't come to gloat, hadn't come to see a man destroyed. She had come because truth demanded to be heard. Her quiet dignity was the mirror that reflected Richard's emptiness, her courage, the force that revealed his weakness. She was not loud, but she was unmovable, and in that stillness she carried more authority than all his wealth combined. The jury's faces hardened, shifting from curiosity to conviction. What began as a question, what could a cleaner possibly know, was now an answer too heavy to ignore. She had known enough, she had seen enough, and she had chosen to act. The courtroom seemed to tilt, the balance of power no longer leaning toward the millionaire who once thought himself untouchable. The empire he built with arrogance and deception was collapsing, not with an explosion, but with the steady dismantling of every lie laid bare. The prosecutor stacked the documents neatly, the sound sharp in the silence. Judge Thompson leaned back slightly, eyes fixed on Richard. The transformation was undeniable. Where once sat a man who commanded the room, there now slumped a defendant exposed by his own hand. And while Richard stared down at the table, his jaw tight, his shoulders tense, the unspoken realization hung in the air. The downfall had only begun. The weight of truth was still pressing, and the revelations were far from finished. The weight in the courtroom shifted from cold legality to something deeper, something that touched the human core of everyone present. The papers on the table were undeniable, yes, but what moved the jury wasn't ink or signatures. It was the woman who sat quietly on the witness stand, her posture calm, her eyes steady, her voice carrying only truth. Sarah's words weren't rehearsed. They didn't need to be polished or dramatic. They carried the simple dignity of a life lived with honesty, and that dignity was stronger than any closing argument could ever be. The jurors, who had entered the trial prepared to sift through numbers and technicalities, now found themselves caught in something much more profound. They weren't just weighing fraud and corruption. They were staring at the contrast between arrogance and humility, between noise and stillness, between wealth and character. One juror, a man in his 60s with glasses perched low on his nose, blinked hard, his pen hovering above his notepad, but unmoving. Another, a young woman in a navy blazer, leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on Sarah as if she were hearing not just testimony, but a lesson. Richard shifted in his seat, looking from one juror to another, searching for cracks of sympathy, but finding none. His wealth, once the invisible currency that bent rooms to his will, now seemed irrelevant. No amount of polished suits, no expensive watch gleaming under the lights, could compete with the quiet authority of Sarah's presence. He had built his life on the illusion that power was measured by money, but here, stripped bare, he was forced to confront the truth. Real power is measured by integrity. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't smirk at Richard's unraveling or savor the gasps of the gallery. She sat with the kind of relief that comes when a burden has been carried too long and finally set down. Her voice trembled only once when she said, "I kept the documents because I couldn't let lies decide the future of people who had no say. I couldn't stay silent knowing the truth." She paused, her throat tightening slightly, then added softly, "I have a son. I want him to grow up in a world where truth matters." That single sentence rippled through the room like a wave. It wasn't evidence in the legal sense, but it was impact in the human sense. The jury felt it, the gallery felt it. Even Judge Thompson, seasoned and steady, leaned back for a moment as if letting the gravity of her words settle into the walls themselves. Richard tried to respond, tried to inject his voice into the silence her statement left behind. "She's playing you," he snapped, his voice raw, almost desperate now. "She's nothing. She cleans floors. You can't let her decide my future." But the words, instead of bolstering him, only exposed the hollowness of his argument. They sounded weak against the backdrop of her courage. His protest only deepened the contrast. A millionaire clinging to arrogance, while a maid stood taller than him without moving an inch. Sarah lifted her gaze briefly toward Richard, not with hatred, not even with triumph, but with something far more disarming. "Pity. You think my work makes me less," she said quietly. Not for the jury, not for the judge, but directly to him. But maybe it's because you've never done honest work in your life that you can't see its value. Her words weren't rehearsed, weren't a weapon, yet they landed harder than any accusation. They cut through the courtroom with the sharpness of truth. And for a moment, even Richard's lawyer closed his eyes, as if absorbing the blow himself. The jury's faces softened, not with sympathy, but with recognition. They saw in Sarah not just a cleaner, but a mirror of every unseen hand that holds society together. They thought of their own parents, their neighbors, the people who worked quietly so others could move forward, and in that recognition, Sarah's testimony transformed from evidence into something larger, a reminder of humanity. Her dignity was unshakable. Even under the weight of Richard's insults, even with the world watching, she had remained herself. That authenticity carried more weight than the millions Richard had tried to hide. In that moment, the imbalance of status that had defined their lives flipped. Entirely, the millionaire sat exposed, powerless, while the maid, the one he dismissed as invisible, held the real authority. Sarah drew in a breath, her chest rising and falling as though she had just completed the longest journey of her life. She didn't seek applause, didn't crave recognition. The look on her face was simply one of release. The release of conscience, of knowing she had spoken truth without compromise. She glanced briefly at Ethan in the gallery, his small hands clutching the wooden rail, his eyes wide with awe. And in that glance was everything. The validation of her struggle, the impact of her decisions, the transformation of her silence into something that could shape a future. The room itself seemed to exhale, a collective acknowledgement that something irreversible had occurred. The documents were undeniable, but what gave them life, what made them matter, was the woman who carried them into the light. Sarah's testimony wasn't just evidence, it was revelation. It was the hidden truth surfacing from the shadows to demand recognition. Richard slumped deeper in his chair, his hand rubbing his temple, muttering under his breath words no one could make out. He had lost control of the narrative. The empire of noise he had built was collapsing under the quiet strength of someone he never thought could touch him. Every time he looked up, his gaze met jurors who no longer saw him as untouchable, but as guilty. Every time he tried to interrupt, his voice sounded less like power and more like desperation. The prosecutor, sensing the emotional tide, didn't push further in that moment. He let the silence do the work, let Sarah's presence echo longer than any question could. The judge shifted in his chair, hands folded in front of him, eyes fixed on Richard. The contrast between the two figures, the millionaire undone by arrogance and the maid elevated by truth, was so stark that it needed no explanation. And yet, in the stillness, everyone knew the story wasn't finished. There were more documents, more layers to uncover, more revelations waiting in the wings. But for now, the emotional punch had landed, and it had landed hard. Humanity had triumphed over arrogance in the most unexpected way, and the courtroom felt the weight of that shift pressing into its very foundation. The jurors leaned back, pens in motion again, their expressions marked not just by analysis, but by conviction. Sarah's truth had moved from testimony into memory, the kind that lingers long after the trial ends. Richard rubbed his jaw, his lawyer whispering something he barely heard. For the first time, he didn't look like a man planning his next move. He looked like a man realizing he had already lost the ground beneath his feet. And as Sarah sat quietly, her hands folded once more, the sense in the room was unmistakable. The balance of power had changed forever. The story was no longer about Richard's empire. It was about Sarah's courage and the undeniable truth that even the smallest voices can echo louder than the wealthiest lies. The court was still, waiting for the next revelation to unfold, knowing that the journey was far from over and that the impact of what had just been spoken was only the beginning of something even larger. The hours stretched on, but the conclusion felt inevitable. Each new document, each cross-examination, each attempt by Richard's lawyer to discredit Sarah collapsed under the same unshakable weight. The truth was too strong to be hidden. By the time the prosecution rested its case, the jury's expressions had hardened into certainty. They had come into the courtroom prepared to evaluate evidence, but what they found was something more human, something that carried both numbers and conscience, ink and heart. When Judge Thompson called the jury back after deliberations, the room was silent, the kind of silence that bends every ear toward the same center. Richard sat with his head low, his shoulders rigid, his cufflinks gleaming but powerless. Sarah, by contrast, sat with her hands folded in her lap, her breathing steady, her presence calm. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't fidget or search the room for reassurance. She was simply there, fully herself, prepared to hear what justice had decided. The foreman stood, paper in hand, and cleared his throat. His voice carried no hesitation. On the charge of fraud, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of corruption, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, guilty. The words struck like hammers, each one ringing with finality. Richard's head fell forward, his jaw tightening as though trying to keep the verdict from sinking into him. But it was too late. The empire he had built on arrogance and deception was officially dismantled in the space of 3 words. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The gallery exhaled as if they had all been holding their breath at once. Some people nodded, others whispered quietly. A few looked toward Sarah with expressions of respect, their eyes soft with admiration. The jury didn't glance at Richard as they filed back into their seats. Their focus had shifted. They weren't thinking of the man who had been convicted. They were thinking of the woman who had made that conviction possible. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his eyes scanning the courtroom before fixing on Sarah. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of both authority and humanity. "This court owes a debt of gratitude to Ms. Miller," he said. "Sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected voices, and sometimes those voices remind us why the law exists in the first place, not to protect the powerful, but to protect the truth." The words landed with more impact than the gavel itself. Sarah blinked, her eyes glistening, though no tears fell. She nodded once, a gesture of respect, of acknowledgement, not just to the judge, but to the moment itself. She hadn't stepped forward to be praised, hadn't risked herself for recognition. But to have her courage seen and named in that space was more than she had ever expected. Richard muttered something to his lawyer, his voice broken, unsteady. "This isn't over," he whispered, but even he seemed to know that it was. His wealth, his influence, his carefully maintained reputation, all of it meant nothing now. What stood against him was stronger than any deal, any bribe, any manipulation. What stood against him was truth, carried into the light by the very person he had called insignificant. The bailiff placed a firm hand on Richard's arm, guiding him up as the sentencing process began. Cameras clicked, pens scratched, and the world that had once celebrated him now recorded his fall. But Sarah didn't watch him leave. She turned her eyes toward the gallery, toward the small face waiting for her with wide, proud eyes. Ethan stood just beyond the railing, his small hands gripping the edge as though holding onto his mother's strength. When she approached, the crowd, parting to make way for her, he reached out instinctively. She took his hand in hers, and the moment was more powerful than the verdict itself. Together, they walked through the heavy doors of the courtroom, their steps light, steady, unhurried. For the first time in her life, Sarah wasn't invisible. She wasn't the cleaner, the background presence. The woman passed by without a glance. She was Sarah Miller, the woman who had stood against arrogance, who had chosen integrity over fear, who had proven that truth can rise from the quietest of places. The people she passed looked at her differently now, their eyes filled not with dismissal, but with respect. And as she held Ethan's hand, walking into the sunlight that spilled across the courthouse steps, her shoulders seemed to lift with something new. Not just relief, not just freedom from the burden of secrets, but the beginning of a transformation she hadn't dared to imagine. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was seen, valued, respected for who she truly was. The cameras turned from Richard's slumped figure to the sight of Sarah and her son walking out together. For the reporters, it was a striking image. A woman with no wealth, no influence, holding the power of truth in her quiet dignity. But for Sarah, it wasn't about headlines or stories. It was about the journey she had taken, the decisions she had made, the hidden truth she had carried, until it finally found its place in the open. The crowd outside buzzed with chatter, some asking who she was, others already telling her story in hurried tones. Sarah didn't stop to listen. She only tightened her grip on Ethan's hand, glancing down as he looked up at her with awe. "You did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice filled with pride. She bent slightly, pressing her lips to his forehead, and answered softly, "No, Ethan, we did it together." And as the courthouse doors closed behind them, leaving Richard to face the consequences of his arrogance, Sarah stepped forward into a future that was no longer defined by invisibility. The respect she carried now wasn't given by titles or money. It was earned by truth, dignity, and courage. The journey wasn't over, but the impact of this moment would echo long after the crowd dispersed, a reminder that the voices most often overlooked can sometimes carry the power to change everything. There are moments in life when the surface of things fools us into believing that power belongs only to those who can shout the loudest, spend the most, or take up the most space. Richard believed that with every fiber of his being. To him, authority was bought, respect was demanded, and silence was a sign of weakness. Yet the journey of this story revealed something entirely different. That true power doesn't come from money, but from integrity, and integrity, unlike wealth, cannot be purchased, hidden, or destroyed. Sarah's courage wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was a series of quiet decisions made in empty hallways and late nights when no one was watching. She didn't choose the path because it would bring her recognition. She chose it because her conscience wouldn't let her do otherwise. That's where transformation lives, in the choices we make when no one is there to applaud or condemn us. It's in those behind-the-scenes moments that character takes shape, and it's that character that one day rises to the surface when the world finally needs to see it. The impact of Sarah's voice didn't come from her job title, her salary, or her status. It came from her truth, and that truth exposed the hidden lies Richard thought he could bury forever. It reminds us that those society tries to silence often carry the loudest revelations. The people dismissed, overlooked, underestimated, they are the ones who sometimes hold the pieces of a story that can shift everything. Think about it. How many times in history, in communities, even in our own families, has the person with the least power on paper been the one to bring about the greatest change? A child who asks a simple question that cuts through pretense, a worker who notices what executives overlook, a friend who speaks honestly when others stay quiet. These are the unexpected voices that remind us wealth and arrogance are fragile, but integrity is unbreakable. When Sarah walked out of that courtroom with Ethan's hand in hers, it wasn't just an ending, it was a beginning. She carried with her the proof that dignity can survive mockery, that courage can rise from invisibility, and that truth, even when whispered, will always outlast the loudest lie. Her journey teaches us a lesson about mindset, that arrogance isolates, but humility connects. Richard chose decisions that led to his downfall because he believed no one could touch him. Sarah chose decisions that lifted her into the light because she believed truth mattered more than fear. And that's where the moral rests. Not in the courtroom alone, but in us. Every one of us carries choices that shape our impact. Every one of us has the chance to either bury truth for temporary gain or bring it forward for lasting change. The hidden truth, Sarah revealed, wasn't just about Richard's corruption. It was about the universal reminder that integrity is the foundation of real strength. Stories like this remind us of the strength hidden in everyday people. If you stayed with me until now, write "Truth always wins" in the comments, so I know you're part of this journey. Because when we share these lessons, when we recognize the quiet heroes among us, we begin to see the world differently. We begin to measure power not by wealth or arrogance, but by courage and honesty. And that shift in perspective is where transformation begins. It's where the noise of arrogance fades and the quiet voices rise. It's where we realize that the greatest victories don't happen in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the hearts of those who refuse to stay silent when it matters most. And as Sarah's story proves, sometimes the most ordinary people carry the most extraordinary truths, waiting for the moment when the world can no longer ignore them. And if you've stayed with me all the way to this point, it probably means this story spoke to something inside you. That already tells me we're building a community that values not just drama, but the lessons hidden behind it, the reminders that dignity, honesty, and courage matter more than appearances. If you felt that too, let me know in the comments with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you're walking this journey alongside me. A simple like on this video helps these stories reach others who might need the same reminder today, and subscribing makes sure you're here when the next one arrives. That way, we can keep uncovering these powerful truths together, and if you're ready to keep going, there's a video right here that perfectly complements what we've just shared. Click it, and let's continue this conversation over there.